Russia has accused Ukraine of downing a Russian military plane, which it says was carrying 65 Ukrainian prisoners of war. Russian officials say there are no survivors. Well, joining me now is Michael Bosserque, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Michael, good to talk to you. What do you believe may have happened here?
Well, it's a rapidly moving story. I don't believe the Russian narrative that they were carrying prisoners of war. After all, Russia has a long history of lying, manipulating the facts, going all the way back to 1986 and before then with the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. When MH17 crashed in eastern Ukraine, they actually manipulated radar data to lie. And then also they're lying about targeting civilian infrastructure and people here in Ukraine. What is very interesting, and again, it's a fast-moving story, and we have to be careful with what comes out, is that the editor of Russia Today has apparently published a list of the alleged Ukrainian POWs on board, and it turns out that many of those names have already been traded in the past. So I think what we're going to see is a tsunami of Russian disinformation and lies, and we all have to be very careful in terms of what we take at face value from that side.
If the plane didn't have Ukrainian prisoners of war on board, what would Russia have to gain by saying it did?
Oh, it's a propaganda war and accusing Ukraine of firing on its own on troops. It is very, very badly behind in terms of making advances in its own war in Ukraine, its own attacks on Ukraine. So anything that can be done to sow doubt here among Ukrainians here in Ukraine and to win PR points, especially among very critical Russian war bloggers, would be good from their side. But again, it's just not the type of aircraft you would use to transport such a small group of people. It would be like taking a Boeing 747 and carrying a small delegation. And the other reason we have doubt here is because if what the Russians say is true, that 3 missiles were fired, or even 2, that plane pretty much fell to the ground intact. A little piece did come off, so that's also why we have very good reason to be skeptical here.
And of course, given that it landed in Russian territory, what answers do you think we will now get? Will there be any independent analysis or verification?
Well, it's very difficult given the lack of access. I mean, I used to be with the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. We did have a small monitoring group on that side of the border. If they were still there, the Russians cut that mission off. They probably could have gone to check it out. We also, there are reports that the ICRC may be looking into this. But, I don't want to get too grisly, but I can tell you, having been at the MH17 crash site, I would not put it past the Russians to manipulate this particular crash site. They will do whatever they can to try and win this PR in this particular case.
It is important, isn't it, the PR war in this war between Ukraine and Russia. Where are we in terms of that war, in terms of Ukrainian losses, for example?
Sure. Well, on the Russian side, I'm sure many people have already seen protests by Russian mothers that their sons have been sent, and Russian wives, by the way, as well, have been sent to the front line and are not coming back. They fear they could either not come back at all or come back severely injured. Here on the Ukrainian side, I have to be very frank with you. We are seeing a bit of a turning point in support for the war, not only in Ukraine, but outside, especially in terms of funding. But here in Ukraine, I mean, I was in Lviv just over the weekend and visited one of the main military cemeteries there. And it was absolutely shocking to see how much that space has grown. There are now hundreds of graves. At the beginning of the war, very few. They've now apparently broken new ground for more fresh graves to be dug. But you're speechless when you walk through there, because a lot of those men who have died are very, very young, 21 years old, for example. And, I saw a lot of families grieving there. I saw servicemen grieving. So if you take that particular cemetery and multiply it across Ukraine, the losses are quite heavy here as well. And one more thing, if I can, Ukrainians really feel they're paying the ultimate price. They're shedding a lot of blood for preventing Russia from gaining more ground and going into Europe. So if there's any debate whatsoever anywhere about supporting Ukraine, this should be something that everyone should take into account, that a lot of young, talented men and women have died, paid the ultimate price in this war.
Michael Bosacue, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council. Really good to talk to you. Thanks a lot for joining us from Ukraine.
My pleasure.
Let's get a look now at the weather.